Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner and viewer. In reference to the wildlife preservation and conservation laws, this is the third lecture we have planned to dwell on the aspect of the contemporary wildlife laws. And in this lecture, what we are going to see that as we have taken in one lecture the bird's eye view of the international law governing the wildlife conservation. On the second aspect, we have discussed about the National Wildlife Conservation Law. And the third aspect, we are going to see on the contemporary wildlife law. The purpose of this lecture is to reflect upon the series of the amendment which has been pursued by the parliament in reference to give effect, and it shows the legislature's seriousness to look at the question of the wildlife protection in India, and by taking a series of amendment and honing out their strategy about the National Wildlife Action Plan into action. In this reference, we have taken note of the fact that the Wildlife Protection Act, by giving an elaborate definition under section 2 and 3, we try to see that the Wildlife Protection Act, by having a very elaborate definition and concept of the wildlife in relating to hunting under section 216 and animal article under 2, we have a series of definition relating to habitat and land definition which are related to taxidermy, trophy and uncured trophy. And in this reference, we try to see that how the chapter of the wildlife has undergone to complete metamorphosis by bringing certain new changes, including changes into the first to sixth schedule of the Wildlife Protection Act. We are going to discuss that whatever section has been implanted in the Wildlife Act, which talks about the penal provision, that section 59, section 60, section 60A, section 61, section 62, 63, 64, 65, and 66 appears to be very relevant from the conceptual understanding of the wildlife conservation and wildlife governance in this country. With this, we try to see that the wildlife laws which have been amended in 1982, 1986, 1991, 1993, 2001, 2002, 2006, 2013 have given a flip of environmental and wildlife jurisprudence of protection of wild fauna and flora and addressing the vital issues of ecological, legal, and enforcement by having an effective amendment under the series of laws starting from 1982 down to this day. We will reflect upon the legislative evolution of 1972 law as an original enactment, how it tried to regulate the trade and commerce, protection of plant species, how it created new authorities and enforcement bodies, and how it tries to clamp the prosecutorial strategy by enhancement of penalties and the imprisonment to bring this law in direct alignment of International Convention on Trade in Endangered Species and other international convention on wildlife. How the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1982 tried to introduce licensing procedure for carrying on business in trophies and animal articles, and how section 11 have been amended to permit capture and translocation of the wild animal for scientific management and conservation, how section 44 amended to regulate grant of licenses for business in trophies and animal article, and the gist and the essence of the Wildlife Protection Act 1982 appears the improvement and to improve the enforcement and control over the utilization of the wildlife resources. Thus, we see after 1982 Wildlife Protection Amendment, the other amendment appears to be the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1986, which has enacted to incorporate provisions of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species on Wild Fauna and Flora under Article 253 of the Indian Constitution, as introduced a new chapter, that is chapter 5A, which tries to prohibit the trade or commerce in trophies, animal articles, and derived from the scheduled animal. It has completely imposed a ban on the wildlife trade such as fur and ivory, and it also tried to see that how the Amendment 28 of 1986, this Wildlife Protection Amendment, before challenged by before High Court and saying that it vacated in 1992 following the intervention of Worldwide Fund for India. Therefore, we can say that this Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1986 is a worldwide fund for nature in India, a specific amendment which have tried to address the question of illegal trade in the wildlife, and it is said to be a landmark towards the international compliance of the wildlife trade restriction, that is chapter 5th of the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1986. Then we find the Wildlife Protection Amendment 1991 followed by 1986 and 1982. It considered the most historic amendment to the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 by considering that it has inserted chapter 3rd A by providing protection to a specified plant, and that has been mentioned under section 17A to 17H. Vis-a-vis, it has added a schedule 6 which is exclusively given the focus on that enumerated plants accorded absolute protection, and we have these categories: the bedom, the blue vanda, the cut, the lady's slipper orchid, the pitcher plant, and red vanda. Thus, we see that the 1991 amendment to the Wildlife Protection Act happens to be a very important act, not only from the point of view of insertion of chapter 3rd A by providing a plant protection a specified amendment, but also extended the scope from fauna to flora by adding schedule 6 and by enumerating the 6 kind of the plants into the category, and it extended the protection to the cultivation, picking, and dealing of such plant under state licensing, and allowed scheduled tribe to collect a specified plants for bona fide personal use. And thus we find that section 6(1) subclause 2 and section 8C subclause CC, which try to give some kind of a partial recognition to the tribal representative in the State Wildlife Board, was also introduced by the Wildlife Protection Act. So, being the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1991 being a wild plant, a specific amendment, have altered the very typology of the chapter third by adding third A and inserting almost 10 sections from section 17A to 17H and adding to the new schedule. Then we find that the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1981 has thoroughly expanded the prohibition of hunting of all wild animals other than vermin and recognized to the need for contemporary ecological enforcement challenges which have been posed, and enhanced the penalties and empowered the honorary wildlife wardens, and also it adopted a mechanism of reward for person aiding in offenders detection by compulsory immunization of the livestock, so that any kind of animal quarantine should not affect the very population and the survival, and the disease is spread and infection is spread in the national park and the sanctuary. This is the method of the compulsory immunization of the livestock under section 33A is very important, and this case also have been the result of WWF India initiative about the compulsory immunization of all the wild animals, so that the quarantine and infectious diseases should not pervade and result into the mass death of the endangered animals and species. The Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1991 is also very important from the point of view of the extension of the marine flora and fauna in territorial water. And this is what is very important, that as we have noticed the question of the habitat under the wildlife, so it talks about the hills, it talks about the plains, it talks about the water bodies and the marine environment. That is, the marine wildlife is also very important in the context of India. Therefore, the length and breadth that is important about the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1991, and this is in relation to the legal activism again by the WWF India in case of Chilka Lake case, and where the Gahir Mata and Bhitar Kanika, Gahir Mata, Bhitar Kanika Wildlife Sanctuary in Odisha in relation to olive Ridley sea turtle being one of the most endangered species and having a great population in India in Gahir Matha and Bhitar Kanika Wildlife Sanctuary, which tries to have a population of olive Ridley sea turtle. So, the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1991 is very important, not from the point of view of having its recognition of the wild animals and prohibition of the hunting of the wild animals and giving more power to the wildlife wardens and the inspectorate and the enforcement, but it is very important on number one, the compulsory immunization, number two, extension and protection to wild flora and fauna in territorial water. Thus, we see that the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1991 introduced a mechanism of the recognition of the tribal rights and ensure harmony between the conservation requirement, conservation imperatives, and the livelihood interest, and provided a legal framework for creation and regulation of zoos and establishment of the Central Zoo Authority is the third important step which has been taken under the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act of 1991. So, we have taken note of the Wildlife Amendment Act of 1982. We have taken note of the Wildlife Amendment Act of 1986. We have taken Wildlife Amendment Act of 1991 being very comprehensive amendment, and we also see that how section 17, which tries to prohibit and picking and possession of it says that no person shall willfully pick, uproot, damage, destroy, acquire or collect any specified plant from the forest land on the notified area, and the plant which has been given under schedule 6, which was added by this Amendment Act. Then after that, we see that it has an exception to the scheduled tribe and scheduled tribe and scheduled community by giving some kind of the right to the forest dwellers. Thus, it is said to be a foundational legal sheet for plant species as well as giving some partial recognition to the forest dweller in matters of having the minor forest produce. Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1991 is also seen from the perspective of the permit for special purposes, restriction on cultivation, regulation of trade and business, declaration of the stock, possession by license, and regulation on purchase. And we see that total sections which has been introduced from section 17A to section 17H have tried to give a focus on the definition which has been given in the Wildlife Act, which talks about the specified plant, and that specified plant was added into Schedule 6 of the Wildlife Protection Act, and these plants receive the highest level of the protection, which is similar to the animal protection under Schedule 1st to 4. So, we see that how the wildlife question, which is addressed by the animals, birds, and now the plant happens to be also in the category of its wider net of protection that can be realized from the perusal of section 17A to section 17H and its definition by the specified plant under section 2 subclause 27 in the schedule 6th, and that is very important, and that addition apart from 1 to 5th is one of the chief feature of the Wildlife Amendment Act of 1991. Wildlife Amendment Act 1991 was followed by the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act of 1993, which introduced Chapter 4th A, which created enabling creation of the Central Zoo Authority. And this is again can say that this is a Central Zoo Authority, a specific amendment that was brought in 1993, and Section 30H is very important, which says that no zoo will operate without recognition by the authority, and the existing zoos which were in existence required to apply for recognition within 6 months of the commencement of the Wildlife Protection Act 1993. It also granted upon the compliance of minimum norms and standard maintenance prescribed by the central government, and thus we see that the norms which has been specified on February 4th, 1992, notified by August 1992, followed an extensive consultation, and it finally and ultimately led to a strengthening of the institutional mechanism of the zoo operation in India, where there has been a deeper crisis in the management of the zoo in this country. So, Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1993 is said to be a Wildlife Protection Amendment Act which is specific to the management and administration of Central Zoo, including recognition and having the compliance with the national or international law. With this, we try to see that how the National Wildlife Action Plan 1983-2001 and National Action Plan 2002-2016 and the of National Action Plan of 2016 to 2031 happens to be a kind of a supplementary role in giving fillip to what we can say in the series of the amendment which has been pursued under the Wildlife Protection Act. But for the time being, having dropping the idea of discussing the National Wildlife Action Plan 1982, because we have discussed in the last lecture the two plans we have reflected upon, and then we here try to see that directly coming to the question of the innovative features of the National Wildlife Action Plan, we will try to see that what has been the amendment which in 2002, because this lecture is encompassing the contemporary wildlife law. So, after looking at the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act of 1993, which was a central zoo management authority and the zoo management specific uh, amendment, we will try to see that how the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 2002 have strengthened the entire regime of the penalties and to look at from the wildlife crime point of view, and this became effective in 2003, and it has tried to enhance imprisonment for Schedule 1 and Schedule 2nd offenses, and it prescribes minimum 3 years and extendable to 7 years and fine not less than 10,000, and for any repeating of the offenses and continuing of the offenses, it will lead to 3 to 7 years of imprisonment and a fine of rupees to 25,000. Thus, we see that the section 51, which specifies the bail condition, that it says the prior conviction disqualifies automatic bail. So, it is so stringent that the court must be satisfied about the innocence and non-recurrence. So, it has already been blacklisted that the one-time offender which have any kind of a prior conviction will disqualify to having a bail, and so the prosecutorial strategy and the criminal law analogy which has been visited under the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 2002 has been made more stringent under the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act of 2002. With this amendment, we also see that it also introduced a system of incentive and disincentive, and it also tried to reward the informer for any kind of the wildlife trafficking and trade and any kind of the uh, offenses which are being committed in the national park and the sanctuary. It introduced a reward of rupees 10,000 to the informer and the whistleblower so that they can aid to the entire criminal administration of wildlife, entire criminal administration of wildlife management, and it also tried to see that it restricted the transfer of the ownership from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2nd in regard to the species by inheritance, and it also authorized that forfeiture of the property of the habitual wildlife offender, and this forfeiture is very important because it is one of the stringent law. The Narcotic Drug and Psychopathic Substances Act of 1985 has such a very exceptional and exorbitant fine and a kind of a provision because of considering it is one of the heinous crime, and Thus, we see that Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 2002 has put the wildlife crime and crime in relation to the wildlife trade and trafficking is something a very heinous crime, and it is treated to be at par with the Narcotic Drug and Psychopathic Substances Act of 1985, and it is being extended to protected area. It is extended to all kind of the wildlife habitat, national park. So the Wildlife Amendment Act can be really be attributed to one amendment, which is criminal law amendment and criminal specific amendment, prosecutorial strategy amendment, followed by the 2002 criminological and penological amendment to Wildlife Protection Act 2002. We will be discussing the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act of 2006, which have created the one thing is National Tiger Reserve Conservation Authority, and it also tried to see that how to in quick succession to the amendment of 2002 Wildlife Protection Amendment Act, how we can move to the question of the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, and that central agency how we can create. So from both the aspect of looking at National Tiger Conservation Authority and as well as the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, it has enacted a Wildlife and Tiger Task Force, the National Board for Wildlife, and as well as the Tiger Task Force has been created and has been provided some legal backing. And thus, in the federal framework of the coordination between by the Memorandum of Understanding between center and state, it emphasizes strengthening tribal and local communities' right within Tiger Reserve, but at the same time, it has created a battery or a kind of a paraphernalia for the conservation of tiger in this country by way of 2006 amendment. Thus, we see that the creation of National Tiger Conservation Authority have defined the core and buffer areas, and it has laid down normative standard for protection, monitoring and management of the tiger reserve. It also ensures that the man-wildlife conflict management can foster coexistence with the local community and respect livelihood right, and however it is to be required to express its seriousness in relation to clamp the National Tiger Conservation Authority, and it should act in right earnest with a greater degree of seriousness. It requires an annual report to be laid before the Parliament, and establishment of the Tiger Conservation Foundation in all states are have made mandatory exercise besides having a stock taking exercise regarding the conservation of tiger in India. On the other side, we see that the two administrative amendment which has been introduced by the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 2006, we see now that there is a Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, and then Crime Control Bureau, as the name suggests, created for intelligence gathering and sharing with the state and to coordinate with agencies for enforcement and capacity building and professional investigation. Thus, it has also increased the fines and punishment, and in reference to any kind of the crime pertaining to wildlife, that there has been a gradual increase in the imprisonment and as well as the fine mechanism which has been introduced by the Wildlife Protection Act, and to see that the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau is having exorbitant power and prosecutorial power, and it has tried to suggest that these two amendment, the Tiger Conservation Authority creation and its effective working, and Wildlife Crime Control Bureau under the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 2006 is considered to be very important amendment, and it is further followed by the Wildlife Protection Amendment Bill 2003, which was introduced in Rajya Sabha, and again the emphasis has been put to see that its alignment with the Indian law and with the International Convention on Trade in Endangered Species 1972, and it has proposed a severe punishment to curb the menace of the wildlife crime, and the major features of the Wildlife Protection Amendment Bill 2013 is a ban on manufacture, sale, and transport of animal traps except for research purposes. That exception has been created. And the Wildlife Protection Amendment Bill 2013 also envisages for regulation of grazing, livestock movement and resource use in sanctuaries. It extends the international trade regulation through the mechanism of International Convention on Trade in Endangered Species 1972 and the schedule which it has been appended. Thus, we see that the redesignation of the Tiger and other endangered species crime control bureau, that that was a kind of innovation which has been done. As we have seen in the last amendment, that there was two authority, National Tiger Conservation Authority and the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau. Now what the proposed amendment happens to be in the Wildlife Protection Amendment Bill in 2013 is try to club together and try to redesignate Tiger and other endangered species crime control bureau as Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, and gives a sweeping power and a sweeping range of action by the earlier Wildlife Crime Control Bureau. And the other features of the Wildlife Protection Amendment Bill 2013 happens to be that it has gradually increased offenses involving Schedule 1 and 2nd, and by saying that 5 to 7 years and a fine of 1 to 25 lakh, and then it for the repeat offenses or for the habitual offender, a different kind of penological strategy has been recognized. At the same time, the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 2013 also recognized hunting right in scheduled tribe areas in Andaman and Nicobar, and the significance of the Wildlife Protection Amendment 2013 lies in strengthening the criminal enforcement and the judicial power vis-a-vis it incorporated international obligation as it has been underpinned in the International Convention on Trade in Endangered Species, and it also tried to provide an integrated protection mechanism to fauna, to flora, and as well as the human right of the people and human right of the forest dweller and the tribal community in this country. And by establishing the National Tiger Conservation Authority and Wildlife Crime Control Bureau and Central Zoo Authority, which has been created in a succeeding amendment by the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, what we see that taken as a whole, the essence which is coming from the 2013 amendment is to reinforcement of a limited participatory conservation with the tribal community and by their social inclusion into the task of wildlife conservation in this country. With this, my dear learner and viewer, we have taken a very cursory look on the contemporary wildlife law in consonance with our discussion in relation to the salient features of the wildlife protection laws, and we have taken note of 1982, 1986, 1991, 1993, 2001, 2002, 2006, and 2013 amendment. Thus, we see the 8th amendment which has been introduced to the Wildlife Protection Act from 1972 till 2013, we see that these 8 amendments reflects India's deeper commitment and to attain the heights and the goals professed under all international wildlife convention, and to boast and to really say that it is one of the India's cornerstone environmental jurisprudence enactment, that is Wildlife Protection Act, with its amendment in a series of amendment, and total 8 amendment. With this, we try to supplement something which is very important, and after 2013 amendment to the wildlife, we will dwell on the question of the National Wildlife Action Plan, of that is the phase 3 plan, as we have National Action Wildlife Plan in 1982, and then we have the plan on the second phase, and then we have a plan in the third phase. The third phase of the plan reflects some of the contemporary aspiration of the wildlife conservation, and thus the third plan talks about the National Wildlife Action Plan, which focuses on ecosystem as a life support system. So this is a kind of a paradigmatic shift, and it emphasizes on the conservation of the natural habitat and the genetic diversity by promoting sustainable use of a species and ecosystem. And thus the current protected area network, which includes 733 sites covering more than 160 square kilometer land, including national park, wildlife sanctuary, conservation reserves, and community reserve. Thus, it recommends the expanding of, recommend very heavily and very earnestly the expansion of the protected area to include terrestrial, inland, water, and marine ecosystem as a high conservation value within the canvas and within the content and within the ambit and within the scope of the Wildlife Protection Act in this country. So, inclusion of terrestrial, inland water and marine ecosystem which carries a high degree of conservation value is very important in heralding a fresh water biodiversity and river ecology and minimizing human-wildlife conflict, and at the same time promoting tourism and conservation and advocating for institutional mechanism for funding by the corporate environmental responsibility program and public and private partnership are some of the basic ethos of the National Wildlife Action Plan, including reaching to the question of the impact of the climate change on the wildlife protection issues. And thus we see that a perusal of the National Wildlife Action Plan 2017 to 2031 appears to be consisting of 17 chapters. That is very important, along with the delegated wildlife notification, which has been introduced under the section 63 of the Act, which empowers central and state government both to indulge into the delegated legislation and framing of the rule and notification to give effect to conservation, to give effect to the trade issue, to give effect to the licensing, trade, zoo management, and plant protection. And a lot of rule has been made under the delegation of authorities and delegated powers under section 63 and 64 of the Wildlife Protection Act in recognition of zoo, in recognition of National Board of Wildlife, in declaration of wildlife stock rule, and then in recognition of wildlife protection rule. So the list is large, and that serves as a ready reckoner to see that how wildlife transaction and taxidermy rule, wildlife stock declaration central rule, recognition of zoo rule, and 1992 to 2000 and wildlife protection licensing additional matter for consideration. So as many as uh, 13 rule, we find that that represent that the amount of the delegated legislation in the plethora of the rules and notification which has been passed under the Wildlife Protection Act time to time to reflect upon the essence and the object and the genesis and the object of the wildlife must be achieved in the right earnest. With this, we also see that there is a gradual wave of recognition of tribal and customary right in the wildlife protected areas, and we find that it is being time to time supplemented by the judicial responses such as Sandeep Brahma Bhatt versus State of Gujarat 2002, Trilok Bahadur Rai versus State of Arunachal Pradesh, Rafiq Ramzan Ali versus A. Jalgaonkar, Jagdish Singh versus State of Bihar, Motilal versus the Central Bureau of Investigation, and J.K. Johnson was a Principal Chief Conservator of Forest, State of Bihar versus Murad Ali Khan. Thus, we see that the catena of the cases which have also given flip and direction and course to the modern and contemporary concerns inserted into the Wildlife Protection Act is also very important when we are discussing a series and a catena of the amendment which has been pursued in after 72 till date, and the promulgation of the third phase of the National Action Wildlife Plan and the delegated legislations rise and rank, and with that of judicial response. This complete our entire lecture on what we can say that the wildlife law the contemporary wildlife law or the Wildlife Protection Act through its amendment and its contemporaneous perspective and the scenario. With this, dear learner and viewer, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.